Hi, this is Barb Tyson, and I'd like to welcome you to another great Salty Dog webinar. Today, we are joined by Dave Flynn of Quantum Sales. He'll be talking about sales, what you need for successful offshore sailing. Before we get started, we'd all appreciate if everyone kept muted and with their video off. Go ahead and type any questions you have for Dave in the chat box that I've opened, and Dave will probably be addressing those at the end of his presentation today. But go ahead and type them in as you think of them. We are recording this webinar, and I'll send out the link as soon as it's processed. And now I'm going to hand things over to Alex Helfand, our Salty Dog Education Coordinator.
Thanks, Barb, and welcome everyone. We have another really excellent presentation today being given by Dave Flynn of Quantum Sales, as Barb already introduced. I want to remind you that as a Salty Dog member, you get a 15% discount on any kind of work you have done by Quantum. They also offer free sail inspections and such. And as Dave will say during his talk, and I'll remind everyone, if you have any questions on anything related to sailing and sales, just reach out to Dave. And if you are interested in doing any work at Quantum, please reach out to him first. And regardless of where you are, he'll smooth the way and make everything work well. Another reminder, we're going to have another one of our open chat sessions at the end of this. So we'll turn the recording off at that time. Everybody can go off of their, they can open up their audio and video. Dave's going to stick around as well. So any questions that we don't get to towards the end of the talk, we'll definitely get to then. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dave. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate the shameless promotion. We'll take that. Quantum Sales is always happy to help you guys. I've been involved with the Salty Dogs pretty much from the beginning. So I know many of you. Matter of fact, I see a lot of names popping up in the box there that have probably already heard half of this, at least most of my spiels on this. Sorry to bore you with this again. We will try to hold the questions to the end just because there's a lot to get through. I'll also give you all my contact information at the end, and that will enable you to, you can just contact me directly. You know, if you want to have, especially if you want to have a more extended one-on-one conversation than the whole thing goes with. So anyway, so yes, this is like letting a lion loose among the kittens, but I'm going to talk about sales today. But this will be strictly non-denominational. This is more about as you kind of graduate up the ladder of sailing and move from day sailing to maybe doing some coastal and overnight stuff to sort of the Salty Dog heart of things, which is sort of offshore and an extended cruising, and then finally maybe do a true blue water adventure, where you're gonna pack it all up and take off through the South Seas or around the world or someplace. My sail needs are going to change, and I've got to decide what's important in terms of the sails that I have, and make sure I've got the right ones, and make sure I got to figure out how they're handling it and all that stuff as I go ahead and do this. Now, unfortunately, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to this question. It all depends on the kind of boat that you have, for sure. The boat in the picture here, this sort of classic, monohull displacement, I think it's a Sabre 42 or something like that. The sail requirements for this boat are going to be different perhaps than what you have. I mean, you might have something, a little sexier. And if you had a, high performance offshore cruising multi-hull, the sail setup could be quite a bit different, and the things you need to concern yourself with would change as well. You can tell this boat's high performance because it's got dagger boards and stuff like that, and it's got this hull flying out of the water. That's not as typical as the cruising catamarans that we all know and love, like this Lagoon here, which, believe me, you don't want to be getting one of those hulls up out of the water. And this boat does not have any kind of boards or dagger boards. That's sort of the real tell in terms of the performance nature of the beast. These boats are usually quite heavy, and they're incredibly comfortable, and you're carrying your world with you, but they require different sail setups than you would have for either monohulls or even high performance catamarans. I mean, they don't typically have inner forestays, for one thing. So we'll try to address sort of the general categories of boats as well as the type of sails that you need, because it is going to vary a bit. So key issues. Gotta be easy to handle, right? I mean, the beauty of our sport slash lifestyle is that we've gotten to the point where boats are, you can handle a pretty big boat with a pretty small number of people. I mean, in the old days, a cruising boat, man, once you got over 35 feet, that was like, whoa, that's big stuff. Nowadays, a 50 or 60 foot cruising boat, two people, a couple can handle it easily. So sails have to be easy to use. They have to have a large range of use. We don't want a lot of sails. I mean, this is coming from your sailmaker. Sails, there's nowhere to put them, right? And so each of the sails that we do add to our inventory, we want to make sure we get as much possible use out of it as we can. We got to have the right sails for your sailing. So if you're in San Francisco, the sizing and construction of your sails is going to be different than it is for boats here in the Chesapeake Bay where I'm based. I mean, we just don't have as much wind. And then obviously as you go offshore, your needs are going to change. You're going to need a few different items. I hate to mention the P word, since I know it's an anathema to most cruising sailors, but obviously the sails have to be durable. We know that, right? They can't fail. That's, for sure. So they got to be rugged and tough, and then we got to make sure they're going to hang in one piece. That's a given. But performance isn't actually a bad word. It's just used in a different context here. I've spent most of my life racing sailboats. And so the last 40 years, I've been in pursuit of going, a tenth of a knot faster upwind. If I can get to the weather mark, a boat length and a half ahead of the boat next to me, I've achieved something miraculous. That's not what I'm worried about when I'm cruising. I don't care if I'm 2 boat lengths for every 2 miles faster or slower. But I do care about maintaining control over my boat. So I want to control heeling specifically. I don't want to, turn the boat on its ear at a moment's notice. And I don't want to develop a lot of weather helm. I want a nice balanced boat. And I do want the ability to sail upwind. We try to avoid it, and as we should, as cruising sailors. But at some point, we really need to be able to sail upwind as well. And the boats we have chosen make that very, very difficult, right? Because we've chosen to bring our whole house with us when we go sailing, and because we don't really want to draw much water, because we want to go to cool places like the Bahamas and things like that, making a modern cruising boat go upwind is a bit of an unnatural act. So everything we can do with sails to help that equation is worth the effort. So when we start getting our boat together, when we walk down that boat show dock and start picking out a boat, most boats these days, new ones, come standard with some sort of basic package. And if we have conventional, sails, we'll have a mainsail with a couple of reefs, and we'll have a single all-purpose roller furling headsail of some kind. If the boat has in-mast furling, and then we don't have to worry about reefs and stuff like that, but that could be an option. But the first sail that we probably need to add as we get more serious about our sailing is some sort of smaller jib, at least in the case of monohulls and performance multi-hulls. We're going to have something heavier and smaller. And then my next priority, because I'll show you the numbers why, is fortunately we spend a ton of time cruising in relatively light to moderate conditions, and we are sailing off the wind, or we're with the wind at least reaching, and much of the time after the beam. So we really, our all-purpose roller furling, Genoa, that doesn't really work all that well with those broader angles. So some sort of light air specialty sail, and there's a whole range of flavor, sizes, confusing monikers that we'll try to address when we get to that. And then finally, we need an insurance policy, right? We need a true heavy air, storm sails. Now, these sails will probably never be seen, much like most major insurance policies. A storm jib is probably something that's going to be sitting down there in the bilge for most of its life. But we need insurance. So we need to look at some sort of storm jib. And then at the back end, for the mainsail, we need to talk about storm trysail, or at least some sort of deep third reef to deal with conditions. So we'll take a look at all these things going forward here. But let's start at the front of the boat, and let's look at our headsail configuration, and let's talk about how big they should be. And my theme here, overriding theme of this whole section, is that we should choose a primary headsail that's as small as possible. Because if it overpowers the boat quickly, and in 12 or 14 knots, we're needing to downsize, that's a very, very limited range. I'd rather give up a little bit on the bottom end and say, hey, in 6 or 7 knots of breeze, this, headsail is a little bit on the small side, but knowing it's got this big sweet spot, and then in 12 to 18 knots of breeze, it's perfect. That's the sail I'm looking for. I've only got one to do it all. Remember, in the good old days, to cover the range that you'd see on a cruise, you'd probably have 3 or 4 sails, right? And so you don't have that operation anymore. So smaller is better. So we need to look at a couple of things. Obviously, again, back to what our average sailing conditions are. I'm not going to use the same size sail on the same boat if I'm living in San Francisco as I do if I live on the Chesapeake Bay. Size of the fore triangle versus size of the mainsail. So there's a simple way to look at boats and sort of tell whether you've got a boat that's headsail dependent or one that's more mainsail dependent. And that is to compare the length of the boom. E is the term in sail plan or sailmaker lingo, versus the length of the fore triangle, which is called J. And that's the distance from the forward face of the mast to where the headstay connects at the front of the boat. If your J dimension is bigger than your E, or your foot length of your mainsail, you're typically a headsail dependent boat. If your boom length is the same or greater than your fore triangle J dimension, then you tend to be more of a mainsail dependent boat. And that's going to change the sizing of your headsails. The other thing to be conscious of is what is this percentage that we talk about all the time? What's a 150? Well, you're talking about LP, the luff perpendicular, or the width of the sail, the shortest distance between the headstay and the clew. We don't care as sailmakers how long the foot is or how long the leech is. That's all a function that's determined by the clew height. But the width of the sail, that's a constant. And so how you get that 150% LP is you look at the length of your J, and LP is expressed as a percentage of the J dimension. So if my J was 10 feet long and I had a 150, then my LP would be 12 and a half feet. So why is that important? Well, if I've got a really big J dimension, then as a percentage, the size of the sail gets big pretty quickly. A 120 or 130 might be a big sail if I have a big J dimension. Where conversely, if I have a small J dimension, then that would be a much smaller sail, and I might need to increase the percentage. So a 150 is not a 150 is not a 150. It all is a function of how big the fore triangle is to begin with. And that's what we need to look at as we sort of examine the equation. So I've got to consider my crew size and ability, right? So if I'm got two young strapping sons who, I want to love to grind winches and pull big headsails in. That's one thing. If it's just me and my 100-pound wife, and I may look at sails that are smaller, right? And age, obviously, and athletic conditions factors into that a little bit. So I'm just going to tone things down if I don't have the strength to handle things. This performance question gets back to what's appropriate for the four triangle versus mainsail question. So if I've got a boat that's headsail dependent, most traditional cutters are headsail dependent. They have big four triangles. And I cut the headsail size way down, then I've just taken away all the horsepower that's there. Whereas if I've got a big, huge mainsail, I can have a small non-overlapping jib and still be fine. So I need to make sure I still have enough overall horsepower, because remember, we're carrying everything with us, and most of our cruising boats are relatively heavy to begin with. So we do need some horsepower, or else we're just going to be motoring a lot. The last thing I can sort of consider in my headsail selection sizing process is I should have some ability to partially furl. And all modern roller furling headsails are built with the ability to partial furl. They're built heavier, and their corner patches are bigger, and all that stuff. So that's going to affect things. And usually the rough rule of thumb is that you can downsize that LP about 30%, or go from a 150 to a 120, and the sail will still set up reasonably well. It won't be perfect, but it'll be okay. So those are the things that I start to consider. But then I look at a couple of other things when I think about headsails. Let's take a trip around the world and see what angles I actually sail at. And again, assuming I go in the right direction, which is west to east, by the way. If you go east to west, it's your own fault. You're going to spend a remarkable percentage of your time downwind. 63% of the time, and this is all based on average wind modeling done for the Volvo Around the World race, in case you're curious, but that's a lot of time downwind. And even reaching is a good 20%. So, over 83, 85% of your time, you're in the sweet spot. You're downwind or reaching. The only 13% of the time that you would actually be forced to sail upwind. Unfortunately, that is a zone that you need to address, because that's the hard thing to do. And it's nice when your boat is capable of doing that. It gives you lots more options in the whole thing. But it also shows that with that big zone there off the wind, we're going to have to do something about especially reaching sails and light air sails for sure. And, breeze velocity wise, same thing. The beauty of extended cruising is most of the time it's pretty nice. I mean, yes, there are times when it's blowing more than 20 knots and things can be uncomfortable and nasty. And we do need to definitely gear up for those things and have solutions, be prepared for that. If you have the right sails for the condition, just like having the right clothes for, going outside in the cold, it just makes all the difference in the world. And then we spend a lot of time in fairly light air, right? 20+% of our time in light air. So the good news is we spend most of the time in pretty good conditions, but we do need to address that time when it's 20 plus, because that's just going to get us in real trouble if we're not prepared. So a Genoa is defined as something that's overlapping. Okay. In other words, the clew goes past the mast. And typically on most traditional, Genoa headsail driven boats, you're going to have an LP of between 120 and 150%. And I'm counseling you to look at that number carefully and make it as small as you can to make the sail the most versatile. If you have a non-overlapping jib, so the trend over the last 30 years has been away from big four triangles. If you walk down the dock at the Annapolis Boat Show this fall, you would not have found more than a half a dozen boats that had overlapping headsails. Almost all the new generations of boats, from Beneteau, Jeanneau, Hansa, DeFore, they all have non-overlapping, they have big mainsails, and they have smaller 100 to 108% typically jibs with, because they have swept-back spreaders, they can actually make them a little bit bigger. The heavy weather jib I was talking about, the small working jib that we need as a second sail, that typically LP wise is like 80 or 95%, somewhere in that range, depending again on the size of your fore triangle. A storm jib, by comparison, is a lot smaller. There is a rule for the maximum size of a storm jib. It can't exceed 0.5% of I squared. Now, what is I? Well, I is the height of the fore triangle, from where the headstay attaches at the top of the mast to where, if you drew a straight line between the bow and the stern, that line there, where that line intersected at that back side of your fore triangle, that's I. Sailmakers and boat designers don't care about height above water, where you are relative to a bridge. They look at your boat as a pair of triangles, and the backside of the fore triangle is I. So if you know your I dimension and you square it and take 0.5% of that number, that's the biggest a storm jib should ever be. So here's a classic example of a large fore triangle and a relatively small mainsail. This is what is this thing? This is an Island Packet 485, but it's a classic cutter. And so the stay is quite far out. And this distance from that outer stay to the mast is big. So typically, that's an overlapping sail there, but I bet you that's only 110 or 115%, right? Because the J is so big. And this one happens to have an in-mast furling mainsail as well. But that's the classic fore triangle headsail dependent boat. This is the flip side of the equation. So this is a J160, and you can see how long the boom is and how big the main is. And relatively speaking, this uses a non-overlapping jib. It can use a Genoa as well, but for most cruising applications, this non-overlapping jib is more than adequate. And that's, I don't know, 105 or 106% or whatever it is. So definitely changes the way you sail the boat and the way you set things up. Here's a classic working jib on a boat with a big fore triangle, right? I mean, there's a kind of short-footed main. This is actually a catch, but short-footed main, big fore triangle. Here is a heavy, a working jib is a generic term. It doesn't mean anything, but it refers to a smaller, heavier jib. And this one here is probably, 80% or something like that. It's also got a clew that's way up in the air. That is often referred to as a Yankee. A Yankee simply means high clewed headsail. It's not a specific size or anything like that. And in this case, this heavy working jib is set up on an inner forestay. And on the outer forestay, it looks like they got something bigger. This is actually what you call a Solent rig with two headstays, out there close together. Here is another classic cruising yacht. This is a Passport 40 from the 80s. This is their heavy working jib. It's a 90% sail, so it just barely overlaps the mast. They have a Genoa on this boat as well, but whenever they go south or whenever they go offshore, this is the sail they put on before they leave the dock. And yes, are they a little underpowered in 6 to 8 knots of breeze? That's okay. They'll live with that. Actually, on this day that I took the shot, that's probably only 12 knots of breeze, and they're going along just fine. So smaller can be better. One of the problems with smaller secondary headsails or heavy headsails on cruising boats is that the manufacturers make no provision at all for how you're going to sheet them, right? They don't have tracks for small, heavy sails. They've got a Genoa track and that's it. In an ideal world, you want what this boat has right here. This boat has the perfect setup. It's got a track, an inboard track that goes well forward. In fact, you'll see that this small working jib sheets between the upper and the lower. So it still gets a good tight sheeting angle. And when you're reaching, look what's out there on the rail, a track that runs the full length of the boat. So I can actually move the sheet to the outboard lead when I'm reaching, which is a very powerful tool, by the way. And since you do a lot of reaching when you're cruising, having a way of sheeting a sail to the outboard rail is really helpful. If you have one of the more modern boats with self-tacking jibs that have just an athwart jib track, you have to have some way of sheeting the sail to the outboard rail, because those systems only work properly when you're sailing upwind. So this is an ideal setup. But you got to think, as you talk to your sailmaker and you think about what you're going to do, hey, I need to think about the size of the sail, but I also need to think, where the heck am I going to sheet the thing? And so that's something to put into your equation. So this is how the big boys do it. As the boats get bigger, this second sail becomes a permanent thing. It becomes set on an inner forestay that usually has some sort of, powered roller furling system to it. And so I've got my big sail on the outer stay. And when that gets too windy for that, I just simply roll it up and I roll that one in. And this stay here on this particular boat is actually pretty far forward too. So, one of the downsides to this so-called Solent rig, where you have a two head stays effectively that are pretty close together, is your outer sail, you can't tack it without rolling it up. Matter of fact, it's pretty much, it's designed really to be a reaching and off the wind sail. And for all your upwind work, you're going to use this inner forestay sail for your upwind stuff. This is a Passport something or other, and all the new generations have Solent rigs, and there's their primary working jib. They've got a big reacher that sits out on that outer stay that's designed just for reaching. Much bigger, more powerful, better than a Genoa. And the sail that actually they probably use the most is what the sail that's in this picture. These are sometimes called, they're kind of called all kinds of things, code zeros and screechers, if you have a multi-hull. They're specialty reaching sails. They're bigger, more powerful Genoas, basically. The key is, for this second sail, you really need to have an inner forestay of some kind. Now, note to all you multi-hull displacement owners out there, you don't get this option. There's no way in the structure of your boats that you can put a second forestay. So your boat actually starts with a much smaller headsail to begin with, usually. That's it. You get one headsail. Sorry, no other option. But on this boat here, this is a classic. This is a Beneteau 473 or something like that. An inner forestay has been added. This did not come stock with this boat. And in fact, somebody had to figure out how to put the hardware with the high load piece of equipment to attach the thing at the bottom, and then has to have a fitting up here at the top as well. So this took a little bit of rigging and engineering to make this happen. And this is a permanent furling system on this one. It's not removable. Again, when you tack, it's in the way. You have to, if you have your big sail up, you got to roll that sail up and put this thing away. But this gives you two sails on tap all the time. This boat actually did the Salty Dog Rally a bunch of years ago, and it was a windy one. And they beat the next boat in by 5 days because they had this little gem right here that they put up and flew the whole way. There are lots of ways to approach this inner forestay question. You'll see the simple way of literally a wire that usually it's long, so it sits on a kind of a curved piece back by the mast that comes on out and plugs into the fitting, and usually has a big lever or a wheel or some way of tensioning it. And it is very important to get tension on that inner stay. This is a heavy sail that we're using in a lot of breeze, and the thing we don't want to have is sag. So if it's sagging the leeward, every bit of sag equals depth, just when we don't want depth. It's overpowering the boat when it does that. So as we set this inner forestay up, we need to think about, hey, how are we going to get tension on this thing? On big boats, there is another option, and this is also something you can do on smaller boats. And that is, instead of having a permanent furling system for this thing, you could have a removable setup. Inside the luff of the sail would be a torsional rope. These are expensive, the ropes, because they have to be rigid. They can't turn when the furling system tries to rotate it. And typically these are used with continuous line furling systems like you see here. Again, to get tension on this particular boat, this big, huge strop here goes down to the deck, and down in the bilge, there's a giant hydraulic cylinder that you pump on up to tension it. They set this up before they leave the dock. This is not something you are going to do on the fly. Hey, it's 25 knots. I think I'll get my heavy jib out and set it up. That's going to be difficult to do. But before they go on deliveries, they set this second sail up. On a smaller boat without hydraulics and things like that, you'll see this stay on a purchase system, usually either a 2-to-1 halyard or a 2-to-1 tack to get enough tension on the whole thing. The beauty of this torsional rope approach or structured luff sail is that it's easy to take down. It's not like that permanent system. So when it comes down, I can actually detach it. I can't exactly fold it, but I can coil it in like a big, a 6-foot circle, or maybe even, accordion flake the thing. And I can get it out of the way when I'm, out for a cruise on the Chesapeake Bay, and just put it up when I actually need it. So there's a bunch of ways to approach this, how do I set up this smaller, heavier sail problem? If I don't have any of those, well, I have to bite the bullet and say, before I go offshore and get serious, in at least if I anticipate any breeze, I have to put that smaller sail on first. And so here I'm getting ready to go. I'm leaving Newport, and I've just got my small jib up, and yep, I'm a little underpowered, but I'm safe. And if it gets windy, I'm all set for the occasion. So that's the other, thought. I personally think it's kind of, going offshore without 2 headsails is asking for it. What if one breaks, right? It's like not having a spare tire, so there's just a practical reason for having a second headsail, as opposed to, the having the right sail for the job. And of course we can roll our big sails, right? I mean, every modern roller furling Genoa is built to be partially furled. I mean, they're heavy enough, they have the corner structure. And in the short term, this is a fine solution. It doesn't give you great sail shape, but it gives you the right size sail for the job, which at the moment like this is really all you care about. The downside, other than sail shape here, is this is pretty tough on the sail itself, right? So if you do, a good 48 hours setup like this, that sail is never going to quite be the same probably when you unroll it full size again. So, it's a good short-term solution, but again, ideally you'd like to have the right size sail, that smaller sail for the job if you really got into this condition. And last but not least, there's the storm jib, the insurance policy. Oddball little sails, this one in storm orange, along with the storm trysail there in the back. They are typically set up with some sort of tack pennant. They set up a little bit higher. The theory being that you want big waves to be washing underneath them. This sail here is being set on a racing boat. Notice, no furling system, no other sail in the way, and all that stuff. So it's pretty easy to set this thing up. But without an inner forestay or some alternative means of setting it up, not so easy on a cruising boat. It's sheeting to a block here about the point of maximum beam, about halfway back. But it's something you need to think about as you design these sails, where it's going to sheet. There's not going to be a built-in place for your boat, that you're going to have to come up with something. If you've got a classic cutter, you may already have a storm jib and not realize it. Here's a traditional cutter, big 4 triangle. This one's on a club boom, this staysail. these on a typical classic cutter, this inner forestay is quite far aft. It's not like the Solent rig boats we saw with a inner forestay well forward. This thing is usually half the way back to the mast, and it means the sail is quite small. If you look at the actual area compared to that 5% of I squared formula, it's probably pretty close. So you may not need a storm jib if this happens to be, your setup. In classic, cutter use, the staysail essentially augments the primary headsail, when you're reaching. And it's usually not very useful at all upwind, but when you're reaching, it works great. But it may, again, be useful as it might be the heavy air sail for you, especially if it's on a roller furling system. I have to mention this because someone's going to ask, and ATN, the man in the picture there, is a friend, and he's done some very clever things. His ATN spinnaker sock is by far the best spinnaker sock on the market, but he also makes something called a gale sail. Everyone has been trying for the last 40 years to figure out how to put a storm jib on without taking my roller furling Genoa down or off. And this is his solution. He basically makes the sail with a sleeve that can wrap around your existing furled headsail. And it just snaps or zippers closed. I think the most recent ones are snaps around your primary headsail, and your headsail has to be furled very tight, and all the sheets have to be wrapped up around it because they have to get out of the way too. They have to come all the way down to the tack. Does it work? Sort of. It's not ideal. There's a couple issues with it. One, you've still got to get it out, and you got to hank the thing on there, and you're going to do it in the least desirable conditions, right? Now, this was on a 10-knot day on the Chesapeake Bay. What if you were in 10-foot waves and 30 knots of breeze? This would be a lot harder, and you're definitely got to go forward. It also is very tough on the furled Genoa underneath it, at least on the UV cover anyway. If you've set this sail for 48 hours and really sailed in storm conditions for, a day and a half or whatever, when you took the sail back down, your furling cover on your Genoa is not going to be what it used to be. It's going to have a lot of chafe and wear. It's a chafe monster, this whole thing. So will it work? Yes. Is it ideal? No. I don't think you're going to find a serious offshore setup that uses this kind of thing. So all this headsail stuff really comes down to, when it looks like this, how the heck am I going to do it? Right? I've got to have the right tools. I've got to have the small jib. I got to have my storm jib, but how am I going to put this thing up? I got to think that through. And it's oftentimes stock cruising boats, no one has thought this through for you. It's just that's not in the marketing brief when you're designing a new, Beneteau or a new Jeanneau. When you go seriously offshore, you'll see that the hardcore types usually have a setup that looks like this. They have 3 furling systems. They don't want to get out of the cockpit. They don't want to go forward. They don't want to change sails. They are willing to accept the fact that they're going to have to furl sails up to tack and things like that, but they end up with a big sail in the outer stay, a medium-sized sail in the middle stay, and a true small storm type jib type sail on the back end. This is if you were any of the shorthanded round the world setups, or this boat's pelagic. This is an Antarctic expedition boat. This is the way they get set up. There are no compromises to be having to go out on deck, and you always have the right sail at your fingertips. So that's a little bit of thought about headsails. Let's move on to the mainsail, and the issues here are batten structure. Of course, this assumes we have a conventional mainsail. If we have in-mast furling, I'll address battens with them, but that's not a big issue here. We need to talk a little bit about reefs. We need to talk a little bit about sail handling systems for the mainsail. Again, if it's not furling. And we need to look at this issue of a storm trysail and say, hey, do we need one, or are we going to do it? How are we going to do it? Well, let's talk battens first. A fascinating subject, one of my favorites. In the good old days, battens were usually, a couple of 3 feet long, and there was, usually 4 of them, and that was it. But over time, sailmakers realized that, hey, making the batten full length has got some serious advantages to it in terms of supporting the whole sail. And in most modern mainsails, at the very least, you're going to have a full-length top batten. I mean, most of them will have the top 2 battens full length, and then a lot of mainsails will have all the battens full length. Excuse me. And if the boat's bigger, it could have 5 or 6 full-length battens. So battens, in the top are really doing a lot of work. So up here in this top section of the mainsail, they support all the area outside the straight line between the head and the clew, what's called the roach. Without the battens, that roach would just flop aimlessly around. And as a percentage of the width of the sail, there is the most roach in the top of the sail. So that's why the top battens are so important. The bottom battens, not as much, but you'll still notice on all modern mainsails that the battens are quite a bit longer than they used to be. They're usually, a third or half the width of the sail on the whole deal. So, battens are structure. They're a good thing. They do a bunch of things. But the most important thing they do is they resist compression. So when you sheet your main sheet on, what really happens is the leech tries to drive towards the luff. And this is what happens as the sail loads up in general. So when that happens, the sail is essentially getting deeper. You have the same amount of fabric between the luff and the leech, but now those 2 edges are getting closer together. So the sail is getting fuller just when you want it to be flatter. So if you have battens that are rigid enough, and by the way, this is a big caveat, the battens to work have to be stiff, and they have to at least stiff enough for that size sail and boat, which means they need to be at least epoxy or carbon on bigger boats. The pull-truded fiberglass battens that you see on lots of inexpensive sails are worthless. They don't have any stiffness or rigidity to them, so they don't give you this big structural benefit. But battens work because they resist this compression. They also resist and help reduce flogging. That's a good thing. When you have full-length battens, the sail will luff at a much slower rate, and that'll help preserve the material too. It'll keep from flogging the resonation and stuff out of it. And they usually help most of our sail handling systems work better too. So if you've got a conventional main and don't have in-mast or in-boom furling, batten structure is something you have to think about. You have to address luff hardware, because remember all that compression force we talked about that the battens are resisting? Well, it's got to go somewhere, and it's going to go into whatever is at the forward end of that batten, which if it's just a slide, that slide is going to become under a lot of stress, and it's going to want to torque and twist, and it's going to get to a point where it's going to not want to allow the sail to go up and down. It's just going to lock up. And all early full-length battens, mainsails that we did back in the early 80s and stuff like that, that was the big issue. We couldn't get them up and down on a regular basis. So along about the mid 80s, this fitting that you see in front of you was invented. This is the original bat slide, developed by a gentleman out in San Francisco and then purchased by Schaefer. It consists of a receptacle, in this case aluminum, that the batten fit into. At the forward end of that is a stainless steel universal joint, and then whatever was the appropriate slide to go in that mast fitting. And the beauty of the stainless steel universal joint is it allowed the batten to twist and move independently and unload the slide, and the batten couldn't push forward at all. The stainless steel joint stopped it. So it couldn't push into the mast, which was the other problem if you don't have a special fitting on the front end. You get push past, where the luff of the sail wants to go past the mast, and that gets ugly and wrinkly and all kinds of things. So once the bat slide came out, of course, hardware manufacturers got heavily into the game, and mostly totally self-motivated, because all these manufacturers like Harkin said, wow, so I could sell one traveler car to you, and maybe this, 5-foot piece of track, or hey, if I could attach a mainsail to this whole traveler system, then I could sell you, I don't know, 12, 14, 15 cars and a piece of track that's 50 feet long. Oh my God. And I didn't have to do anything. It was the same exact piece of equipment. So Harkin, Fredrickson, Lumar, Ontal, they all got into the game. And this is a very good way to do it. I mean, these your battened sail will go up and down like a rocket ship, but they're obviously quite a bit more expensive. So on bigger boats over 50 feet, they're an absolute requirement. You really just can't do a fully battened main without some sort of specialized hardware that looks like this. On smaller boats, there are some alternatives. A company called Tides Marine makes what they call their strong track system. And it's essentially, it's an ultra high molecular weight plastic where the backside matches your existing groove. It could be a flat shape, could be a round shape, could be extra, whatever. And it literally, they make it for your boat, and it slides up into your existing track. And it comes with receptacles and slides, and it works great, and it's relatively inexpensive. And for boats up to 48, 50 feet, it's perfect. So if you got full length battens, great, but you got to do something about the luff hardware. So the next question, again, for those of you with conventional mainsails and not in mass furling systems, reefs. How many? Where? How do we set them up? All that stuff. So the classic formula for the placement of reefs is that you would space them at 12.5% of the luff length. They are not, contrary to popular opinion, have anything to do with area. We can calculate that for you, but basically we just look at the luff length of the sail, calculate 12.5% of that, and that's where the first reef goes. Second reef goes at 25%. Third reef goes at 37.5%. And that's the way reefs have been spaced since time immemorial. And I don't know why exactly, but it seems to work pretty well. But there's no hard and fast rule that says this is what you have to do. Okay. And a lot of particularly monohulls, you don't even have the hardware for third reef. If you're going to put a third reef in your boat, which would be nice if you were going offshore, you got to figure out how you're going to do it. There might not be a shiv in the boom. There might not be a way of setting the tack up. So an alternative is to say, hey, look, what if I just put two reefs in with different spacing? And I ignored this 12.5% then. What if I said, okay, I'll put a reef in at, I don't know, 15 or 18%. And I'll put my second reef right up here where that third reef would be normally. I'm taking the bigger bites, but do I really care? I'm usually for most cruising applications, it's not a big deal whether I've, fine-tuned the mainsail area to that distinction. So that's certainly one way to look at it. Now, multi-hull mainsails are always going to have 3 reefs. And in some cases, they're going to have 4 because they're huge. The roach profile, is, double or triple of that of a normal monohull mainsail. They don't have a backstay to worry about. And they're very much mainsail dependent boats. So on multi-hulls, you are going to find the provisions in the hardware for doing 3 and even 4 reefs. So we all know that reefs are important. When you go offshore, it needs to be a matter of, minutes and something simple as tying your shoes to put the thing in, because I don't want to be stumbling around figuring out how I'm going to do it or thinking about it. I just want to be simply able to take a bite out. And the technique is, we've all kind of familiar with this, is we lower the main halyard and we get the new tack secured. This is the simplest possible way that you're looking at right here. This is simply a hook with a strop and it goes over the hook. And then once that hook's over there, you retension the thing and your new tack secured. This is simple, effective. It does require that you get out of the cockpit. That's the downside to it. But the other beauty of it is notice how this reef tack, this new tack fitting is pulling forward. And that allows us, when we pull on the back end, it allows us to get the sail really, really flat along the bottom. Because when we're reefed, we want the sail to be a pancake, an absolute board at the bottom. And if we don't have a forward component to this tack setup, then we can't do that, which is the problem with single line reefing, or one of the potential problems with single line reefing. You will find that most hardcore offshore sailors do not like single line reefing. Boat manufacturers love it because it allows them to clean the deck up and keep, one line where there would be two. But as you can see in this photo, here's a simple system where the line comes straight up out of the boom and goes directly to the new reef tack. When we start pulling back at the back end on this sail, there's really nothing to keep that from going aft. And so it's very hard to get the foot as flat as you would like. There's also a ton of friction in these systems. Typically, these in-boom systems have a reverse purchase inside the boom, and there's lots of lines going everywhere, and it's going up to the sail and down into the boom and up to the sail again and back down to the deck and all the way back to the cockpit. They are friction monsters. So they're not as easy as they're cracked up to be. You can get them to work well. One of the things I think that's important is if on this boat, if this line went up through a block or something on this and then back to the mast to a pad eye, and in fact, there's a pad eye up there for the deep reef you can see up there, then you'd have a forward component to the reef line, and that would enable you to get the thing flat along the bottom. But single line reefing is not quite as easy to use as you would think. It takes some playing around with to get the whole thing right. So be forewarned. At the back end, things are pretty straightforward. Reef line comes out of the boom, goes up through the sail, and most modern sails are loose-footed, so the thing just ties off around the boom. And now I've got my down force and I've got my aft force because I want to be pulling that sail down and back. I don't care if the clew gets all the way down to the boom. Matter of fact, I'd rather it didn't get all the way down. I want the sail to go flat before it gets there. And if the reef height is spaced correctly, it will. That'll keep you from crunching the sail up and chafing it and wearing it through. Now, what do you do with all the sail in the middle? Well, you get, 4, 5, 6 of your friends to, pull the thing on up there and grab some sail ties and, tie the thing on up and out of your way. No, actually you don't. You don't have 4 or 5 or 6 friends. You need to have some kind of handling system. And the simplest handling systems are lazy jacks. Lazy jacks are nothing more than an exterior, cradle that, is a couple of V's of line that goes up on either side of the sail. And when the sail comes down, it comes down between them and it can't fall off the boom. So it makes, when you drop the mainsail coming into the dock, it keeps you from having to deal with it right away. And certainly when you're reefing, it takes care of all that sail in the middle. That just goes away. So on my cruising boat, no matter what, at the very least, I would have lazy jacks on there. The next sort of step up the ladder is to say, man, putting these mainsail covers on is a pain in the butt. So why don't I integrate my mainsail cover and my lazy jacks together? And now when the thing comes down, it'll go not only between the lazy jacks, but the lazy jacks will guide it inside this sail cover. This is initially called a stack pack that the Doyle team invented back in the late 80s, but it's basically an integrated sail cover. And you'll see them all over the place. It's sort of become standard issue in the charter fleets and stuff like that. The Dutchman is another alternative handling system. And I call it internal lazy jacks. So instead of being outside the sail, you have a series of grommets through the sail, and you have a monofilament line that goes from the foot up, back and forth through these grommets. And now when the sail comes down, it's contained upon these guidelines, and it comes down and stays on top of the boom. And the beauty of it is, since the line's internal, One of the problems with lazy jacks, either on a sail pack or not, is when you put the mainsail up, the battens want to get hooked underneath the lazy jacks. And so you got to be a little careful, guy. You got to be just perfectly head to wind. You got to kind of watch the battens as they go through. With the Dutchman, you don't have to. You just pull it up and away you go. And the other thing the Dutchman does for you a little bit is it flakes the sail. These grommets are spaced in accordance with the slides on the luff of the sail. And so when the sail comes down, they do a pretty good job of flaking the whole thing, at least after some time when the sail gets some memory in the whole thing. So Dutchman, a good potential setup for medium-sized boats when you want something to give you another hand flaking the sail, basically. So as boats get bigger and booms get higher, no matter what you do with lazy jacks or integrated sail covers or Dutchmans, at a certain point, the problem becomes reaching it. The boom is up there high enough above the deck where all this becomes difficult. And especially on center cockpit boats where the boom is way up in the air. And on most cruising boats, remember, you're ending up with a lot of canvas work. So the boom is not the most accessible thing in the world. So at that point, you now start considering alternatives. And in-mast furling is one, and in-boom furling is the other. And they both work. On the left, you've got an in-mast furling setup. And so the sail basically, just roll inside the mast is a furling system. Taken from, just looks like a head safe furling system, but it's stuffed in the mast. And you've got an outhaul car on a track, and you can wind the sail right on into the mast. On an in-boom furling system, you wind it down onto a mandrel that's inside the boom. But again, basically a furling system in the boom. In-mast furling is very popular on bigger boats because it's simple and the functionality is about as easy as it gets. It doesn't take a lot of, it's user-friendly and all that stuff. The downside is, of course, remember those batten things we made such a big deal about a few minutes ago? Well, you really can't have that. Well, you certainly can't have horizontal battens, right? They're gonna go crunch when you try to roll them up inside the boom. So you end up with a sail that instead of having positive roach, has to actually have some hollow to it. So you end up losing. It's just like a headsail, and so you end up losing, 20-25% of the size of the sail. You can make it a little bit bigger if you decide to add vertical battens. Vertical battens will help support some area on the leech and kind of clean things up a little bit. They don't resist compression, right? They're not running in the right direction for that, but they can help make you a little bit bigger sail. The problem with vertical battens, from my perspective, and as sailmakers, we have been trying to do something about this for the last 30 years with mixed results, is to gain a little bit of area and to gain a little bit of cleanliness to the leech, you potentially compromise the functionality of the furling system, right? Because now you've got these big lumps that have to go inside the mast every time. And these are pretty small cavities in there. So it makes it easier for the sail to jam. So, we've done a lot of work with carbon full-length battens and made sails that look pretty much like a normal sail that go in and out just fine. But buyer beware. You're usually getting an in-mast system because you want ease and simplicity. Adding battens to them will make them more complex and potentially create problems for you down the road. So just be a little careful with that. So here's an in-boom mainsail. And now the good news about these is because the thing rolls up around the boom, I can put as many battens as I want into it. And so I have the same batten structure as I would have normally. Actually, this is a Leisure for Old Force Bars product, and they come with 6 full-length battens. So the sails are absolutely beautiful. I mean, the shape, the sizing doesn't change whatsoever. And they reef nicely too, by the way. The only downside is a little bit of functionality. You gotta be able to pay attention to what you're doing. And particularly when you're rolling them up, you have to be able to watch this area up here near the mast where the sail's rolling around the mandrel, okay? If you can't see this operation going on and you can't control the halyard tension as you drop the sail, you will tear it at some point. That's just going to be the case. So that's the downside. But the beauty of them is they're a full-size, wonderful sail, and they reef nicely, and they can reef pretty much anywhere. So there's some good things about them, but they're more operator intensive than an in-mast system. So last question, do we need a third reef or a storm trysail? Well, first of all, let's look at a storm trysail. It is a bizarre little sail. It flies on a tack pennant, right? Because remember, this sail is designed to be flying above. Your mainsail would normally be on here, right? You're not going to take your mainsail off to put the sail up in the track. That's what they did here on this racing boat, but you're not going to do that on a cruising boat. So there's going to be a tack pennant that raises the thing up in the air a bit and allows you to get it above your mainsail. It's going to sheet not to the boom, but back here to the quarter, usually to the spinnaker sheet blocks. It's a very weird geometry for a sail. You can't buy one of these things off the shelf. It's got to be really made just to fit your boat. And you gotta, so it's a tricky little beast to make. The big problem, here at the dock in no breeze, as we see in this picture, it's pretty straightforward, especially since I don't have that pesky mainsail in the way to make getting the sail, up and down easier. But that's not the way it is in the real world. In the real world, I've got to do something to make it possible. I'm not going to be taking the slides of my mainsail out so I can put the slides of this new storm trysail in it. If I'm going to have a storm trysail that works, I have to have a separate track. So you can see up the side of the starboard side of this mast, there's a separate track that goes all the way down, actually goes all the way down to the deck. And in a perfect world, going offshore, you have that storm trysail already hanked on, slides in on the track, and it gets nasty and I got to use it. I, lower my mainsail completely and I hoist my little storm trysail up on its tack pennant above the whole thing. That's the only way you're going to get this thing to work. You can do them. I've even seen them like this one on an in-mast furling setup. But if I had an in-mast furler, there's no way I'd have a storm trysail. One of the beauties of in-mast furling is that the mainsails really set up nicely when they're partially furled. They have the same geometry as a storm trysail, basically. So I just don't think you're going to need a storm trysail if you have in-mast furling. That's the other kind of benefit of the whole setup. So storm trysail or third reef. Here we are off the coast of Tasmania, in the Bass Straits, and it's blowing a lot. And, the waves are 20 feet high. What am I going to do? Well, you're going to do whichever is easiest. And so if you've got a proper storm trysail track and it's all set up, yeah, I can go ahead and put it up. But if I don't have that, well, a third reef is going to be my ticket. So either one works fine. It just the system has to be set up for it to work. And there's my full storm jib, storm trysail setup in orange. So as a final sail inventory, I'm going to end up with if I don't have in-mast furling, I'm going to have some sort of fully battened main. I'm going to have 2, maybe 3 reefs. I'm going to have the smallest Genoa I can find that still gives me enough horsepower. I'm going to have a second heavy air jib, working jib, staysail, whatever you call it, set up on a secondary inner forestay. I'm going to have a provision for a storm jib on that stay as well. And then I'm going to have light air specialty sails, the thing that actually you probably are going to use most of all the sails you add, all this disaster we've talked about of dealing with heavy air and having the right small sail for the job. The ones you really use are the light air specialty sails. There's our setups. Here's our depowering sequence. Every boat's different, but you're going to get to know your boat that, okay, I can carry a full main and full headsail up to 12 knots. And then I need to reef the main, or I need to partially furl the Genoa. And that could be dependent on whether my boat's a headsail boat or a mainsail boat. Usually if my boat's got a big 4 triangle, I'll reef the main first. Whereas if I've got a big main and a smaller headsail, I'll go down in headsail size first. And then finally I get both of them reefed, and then I get a double reef, and then I get 3 reefs or just a jib or something. But I need a map to take me through the full range of stuff so that it's kind of becomes automatic, particularly at night. It's like, all right, it's blowing 18. I'm going to put a reef in, period. So think about having a depowering sequence, but also think about having some specialty light air sails. And this is a confusing topic. I should do an entire talk on this at some point. Maybe the dogs will have me back for that. I'll do one for you, because there are all sorts of sizes and shapes. They can be offshore, inshore sailing. Yeah, they're great for lighter sailing, but we confuse the issue entirely because there's so many names. All right, there's flashers, thrashers, crashers, code zeros, code sails, helix, all those are marketing terms. Okay, just be aware that these come in a lot of different sizes and shapes. I like to divide them into 2 basic categories: specialty reaching sails and then true downwind sails. That's sort of the way I look at it. And here's the same boat. This is a J160. Here are 2 asymmetrical spinnakers, but look at how different they are. On the right, this one's relatively small and flat. That means it's going to be able to reach really nicely, right, at closer angles. On the left, we've got this big, broad thing that's as wide in the middle as it is at the bottom, and it's real deep. It's going to be a great broad reaching and running sails. I can do everything inside this spectrum. This is a big design box. So figuring out what angles you want the sail to work at are the trick with these specialty sails. And particularly when you start talking about these flatter specialties, like the quote unquote code zero, that's a whole different beast. And really you need to look at, hey, what apparent wind angles do I actually want the sail to work at? And what is my boat actually capable of? If I've got a high performance, multi-hull, it's going to be a lot different movie than if I've got a displacement monohull, rolling along. On multi-hulls, by the way, these code zeros are typically called screechers. God knows why, but that's the term that's developed. But these specialty reaching sails come in all sizes, shapes, and flavors, and you need to figure out what fits into your inventory and what works with your boat. Handling systems for these off the wind sails, the rage now is roller furling systems, right? You can furl anything, right? Just ask Harkin. But in reality, there are some limitations onto what you can furl. So this boat here is a beautiful Italia. Notice just the one beautiful Italian model sailing the boat. Yeah, it's the way they come with that. This thing's set up for roller furling. It's got a bowsprit, so there's room in front of the headstay for a furling system. It's a fractional rig boat, so there's lots of room at the top. If I have a masthead cutter from the 1980s, it's not going to have these things. And so I'm going to figure out how to jam a furling system in there. It's going to be much more difficult. The other thing to think about when you're thinking about to furl or not to furl is how big is the sail? If I have a full-size asymmetric spinnaker, with a girth of 90 or 100% of the foot length, all bets are off when it comes to furling. I don't care what kind of system you have. It's not the system. It's just the sheer size of the sail. But if I have one of these specialty reaching sails, screechers or code zeros or whatever, then it probably will furl quite nicely. So there's a bunch of questions to answer that you need to think about. But these are critical sails. I mean, when I talk to most cruising sailors who've done offshore passages, it's the sail they have up 70, 80, 90% of the time. So to conclude, we need to have the right sails for the job. They obviously have to be strong enough. We have to think about handling and how we're going to get them up and down. Don't think that performance is not important to you. You still want sails that have nice shapes and stay flat when the breeze comes up. And definitely think about specialty sails, both the light air version and, and the heavy air stuff. So we've covered a ton of ground here in the last hour and 10 minutes or 5 minutes. I don't expect you to suck this all in at once. Obviously, there's going to be a tape of this, but the biggest thing is we're here to help. Part of the beauty of your Salty Dog membership is you get free access to folks that can help you out. And I'm always happy to sit down with you, talk about your specific problems and questions and stuff like that. So here's my contact information. Everybody else has it. So feel free. Sunday nights are my favorite. No, really, email or call anytime. And we'll see if we can get you sorted out. But that is all for my chat. And I'm going to turn it back over to Alex.
Well, thank you very much, Dave. It's been a great talk. And I will make an appointment with you for arranging the next talk on specialty sales, since a number of people have already indicated that would be a really valuable thing. So maybe we'll hold off on asking questions about that tonight and focus more on the things that we've talked about so far. Looking back in the chat, I know you did go over what a Yankee is, but there was, I think maybe they may have missed it. Could you just review what a Yankee for sale is?
Absolutely. So a Yankee is a term that I don't know where it came from originally. I think it's like in the late 1800s or something, but it basically just refers to a headsail that has a high clew. And it's not a specific size or anything, but basically, if you can't reach the clew, that's usually a Yankee. And the benefits of a Yankee were twofold. One is that on a sail with on a boat with multiple headsails, in other words, like a staysail and an outer sail, having a higher clew enabled that staysail to work better, right? It gave it room to breathe underneath the thing. The other thing that higher clews do for you in cruising sails is when you ease the sail out on a reach, the lead doesn't change as much, okay? You're still pulling down. If the clew is low, as soon as you ease the sail out, you're no longer pulling down. You're pulling in and out. And so the clew lifts, the distance between the head and the clew closes down, and the sail twists and opens up, and you lose the top of it. But Yankee is just a colloquialism, really.
Okay. There was another question when you were talking about in-mast furling and battens and such. I think somebody wanted to know, I guess, what your view is on in-mast furling and cats. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, you don't see in-mast furling on catamarans much because they're so mainsail dependent, right? I mean, typically they're set up with really big mainsails. Most cruising catamarans don't have backstays, right? So the beauty of it is you can put as much mainsail back there as you want. And usually design-wise, they are very big on mainsail and very small on fore triangle. So if you go to an in-mast system on a catamaran, you're not taking 15 or 20% of the mainsail away. You're taking 40 or 50% of the mainsail away. So it's a big bite. So unless the boat was really designed for it, I think it would not be a great way to go.
Okay. And I know you mentioned before, typically, and I know my cat's that way, and probably most of them, almost all cats have 3 reefs, probably because of the amount of power that you've got in those. Okay. Another question.
Sometimes 4.
Some have 4, yeah. Could you comment on the use of whisker poles?
Sure. So I didn't get to talk about downwind stuff, and I do a talk that I've done with you guys on sort of getting the most in terms of sail trim and stuff like that. And I do a section on downwind sails, and whisker poles are a great tool. they enable you to go dead downwind, which can be handy. Asymmetric spinnakers, they aren't designed to go dead downwind. You can go at quite broad angles, maybe as deep as 155, maybe even 160 degrees true wind angle. But that last 20 degrees between 160 and dead downwind, that's no man's land unless you have a whisker pole. Going wing on wing is great if you have a whisker pole. You can't go wing on wing unless you have something to stabilize the headsail on that side. If you've got that pole to stabilize the headsail, then you actually have a pretty big range of steering. You can actually head up to 160, 155 and let the pole forward a little bit, or bear off to dead downwind. So it enables you to go just where you want to go, assuming there's enough wind, right? If you don't have at least 10 or 12 knots of breeze, you're not going to generate enough apparent wind velocity to go dead downwind, no matter what you try to do. So in under 10 or 12 knots of breeze, you really always are tacking downwind. And that's why an asymmetric is so effective. But between about 10 or 12 and 20 or 22, a whisker pole is a great tool. It just has to be, again, you have to set it up properly. You have to, ideally it's on a mast track so it's out of the way and it's easy to use and swing on out there. But yeah, it gives you a whole nother mode downwind, a very stable 10 to 22 knot range. Usually once it gets windier than 22, 25, I don't know. Well, it depends on how good a helmsperson you are and can you see what you're doing and then, where the wave's like. But at some point I just say, better part of valor is to head back up. I'll keep the wind on the one side of the boat as opposed to, going right behind me.
And I guess the whisker pole primarily is for the monohulls, since with the cat, you can kind of use your other hull to wing out the headsail.
You multi-hull guys have a huge advantage. Your boats are really wide. And so you can go dead downwind and you can pull. The other thing you can do that's great on a multi-hull is if you have an asymmetric spinnaker, let's say it's tacked to a short pole or something on the center line as a typical setup, you can add a second tack line and you can pull that sail to the weather bow and you can go really deep with that in a very stable setup. So yeah, multi-hulls do have some downwind options that the rest of us don't get.
Now, back on reefing, we had a discussion last week on catamarans and reefs, and I know some of us have recently have experienced tearing out the reef line on the clew where it just wears through. What's your thoughts on how to minimize?
So reef lines are obviously chafe monsters, right? Because they're sitting in there under high load, sawing back and forth, and just having a stainless steel ring in the sail, which is the basic way to do it, definitely you're gonna have to watch out for chafe and reef. The other things you can do is obviously add some of these ferrules, these aluminum ferrules that are made. Ontal, they all make them now. Ontal it's a good version. That reduces the friction. We used to put blocks in the back of sails for offshore reef sails, literally build a block into the sail. But the problem with that is you have this big, heavy weapon, in the back of your sail it's tough on the sail, but also, it's just flogging around, beating the boom up and things like that. There are some of these locking mechanisms. So on high-tech offshore boats, Grand Prix racing boats, the clew reef is on a lock, right? It comes down to, there's either built into the boom or just on the exterior of it. Literally, it comes in and clicks into a lock, and it's just there. So there's no chafe or wear or anything on the whole thing. Those are expensive and tricky to set up correctly. But once you get to a certain size range, that make a lot of sense. There are some intermediate. I know one of the Salty Dog members who has a catamaran put it's basically like a hook that the thing locks. It's an inexpensive reef lock. Basically, I forgot what it's called, but Alan Roberts did it, and he loves it. His report back is it works great, and he got rid of all the chafe because he was going through his 12 mil Dyneema lines at $4 a foot faster than he wanted to.
Right. Yeah. In fact, Alan talked about that last week. So I was just curious if there was anything other than his suggestion. That's great. If no, does anybody have any other questions before we switch to not recording anymore? I mean, I have one, but I didn't want to monopolize the session. So while you're thinking, so for the catamarans that don't have that option of an inner forestay, are there any other ways of rigging a smaller head sail?
Not easily. That is a question that confounds everyone. Actually, you guys have a great multi-hull guy who's doing some talks with you, the designer,
He just did.
What did he say to that question? Did you ask?
I don't think, people have to remind me, I don't think we specifically asked that question. I'll go back to him and
so most of his boats, by the way, are high performance boats with dagger boards, and they have a center, a longitude or whatever they call the thing. They have a beam that goes out from the mast to the forestay, and so they'll have inner forestays. Right? They'll have provisions for secondary. It's just these cruising displacement catamarans that have a net up there, and there's no structure to put anything in, and so you basically, what they do is, if you read about the tactics and strategy in real heavy air for those deals, is they just furl the jib up, they get down to a triple reef mainsail, and that's their setup. Because they don't have boards, they can't go upwind, right? Pretty much. So they just eliminate that option. So that's that. I've found no way though on one of those boats of setting up a second sail. Even if you took the big sail off and put a small sail on the outer headstay, the clue would have to be 8 miles up in the air, because the tracks are usually quite short. There's no provision for tracks to sheet a smaller sail to.
Okay. Anybody else have any other questions? Because if you don't, as we did last week, we will have Barb wrap up the session, and then we'll kind of open it up for everybody to ask questions and chat some more. And Dave's agreed to stick around a little bit. So Barb, you want to do the wrap?
Yep, I'll go ahead and I'm going to stop the recording.